beyond. Listen, and all you desire will be yours. Welcome to Spider-Dan and the Secret Doors. Prepare for Prattle.
It was a defensive exercise.
Yeah, best defense is a good offense. Or is it the other way around?
Welcome to Prattle World. I am your host, the ever-amazing, ever-spectacular Spider-Dan. And in this podcast, I spotlight entertainment's best-kept secrets that a mainstream audience may find boring. And welcome to Secret Defenders, where I task my guests to defend their favourite movies that are underrated, infamous, or obscure. And we have one of the original guests on the podcast back after far too long a time. We talked about Jaws exploitation last time, and we're going in a totally different direction entirely. TD Velasquez is back to share his opinions and defend one of the lesser-known Quatermass films and or serial, whichever you watch of this particular version. TD Velasquez, you're back. How the bloody hell are you?
I'm so happy to be back, Dan. Hello, sir. It is an absolute thrill to be here. Yes, your exploitation. A word I don't often use, but I got to use it on your show, and I don't often get to rattle on about Orca. So it was an absolute privilege, and here I am, and you've given me the chance to talk about the Quatermass conclusion and one of my favourite writers, Nigel Kneale. So, you know, I am indebted to you, and I'm just thrilled. How are you, fella?
I'm very good. I'm still enjoying your podcast, and now the podcast starts, a classic, which I've been on many a time. I've left a lovely review for it as well. But anyway, we're here to talk about Nigel Kneale, because it is, as you stated just before we started, his centenary this year. His birthday's just passed. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the great man himself, the science fiction writer, and your link and how you found him and his work and the whole Quatermass franchise.
Fantastic, with absolute pleasure. If I have a purpose in life, Dan, it's to talk to people who don't know much about Nigel Kneale. Thank you again for this outlet. And by the way, thank you for your wonderful contributions to our podcast over the years. We think of you as an honorary host. You're always welcome. And, you know, for listeners to this podcast, you're intrigued about what we're about to discuss. You know, Dan did come on our show to talk about Halloween 3, which is a movie that, uncredited, was written by Nigel Kneale. And one of the ways that I like to get into Nigel Kneale is go, oh, you're a Halloween fan. Do you know who wrote Halloween 3? Because often people obviously don't know. I mean, Halloween 3 could also be a Secret Defenders movie because it's a cult movie, but it was despised for a long time. It's coming into its own, I think, as we've discussed, and I know you've discussed elsewhere. So who was Nigel Kneale? Basically, I like to think of him as the man who invented television, or invented television drama. He was born in 1922, and TV drama developed a bit differently in America and Britain. In America, TV drama, because they have Hollywood, and they have a massive kind of machine of making movies, and that kind of has been in place since the early 20th century. When TV came along, they started needing to make soap operas. They'd basically make them like movies. They'd be made by, you know, people who directed maybe low-budget movies in those days when movies were just cranked out of tiny budgets to make a bit of money, different films every week and so on. And that would turn into the same engine that would produce endless soap operas and detective dramas and things like that. And they tended to be kind of like movies, but movies that had very little money. And dare I say, were not always made by people with a great amount of talent. They're like, I never want this guy to direct a movie for me again. Fine, we'll give him a job in television, kind of thing. In Britain, it was quite different. Kind of post-war, you had TV starting up. We'd had radio for a bit longer. And we also obviously have a great tradition of theatre in this country. And rather than, because we don't have the big film industry tradition, TV drama was like a weird thing, kind of halfway between theatre and radio, but with pictures. So they'd like film plays and they'd film radio scripts and not really know what to do with the visual side of it. It's mostly done live as well. These programs where actors were actually speaking the lines and it was going out live, and the audience, there was no editing, the audience would see any mistakes. It was all from studios. So Nigel Kneale was a guy who, having grown up on the Isle of Man, initially thought he wanted to be an actor, so he went to RADA, and he seemed to do quite well. But in his 20s, he redirected his energies into writing, and he had a very successful collection of short stories published, which I've just bought. In fact, it's literally this week just been re-released. It's called Tomato Cane and Other Stories by Nigel Kneale. It's been re-released in a beautiful hardback with an introduction by Mark Gatiss. It was published in 1949. It won the Somerset Maugham Award for Literature. And it's one of only 2 books he ever wrote, because just off the back of that one book of short stories, he was poached by the BBC. A senior BBC guy basically had a limited amount of budget to find writers for TV productions, and he spent all of it on paying Nigel Kneale. It's like, right, we'll just get Nigel Kneale. And Nigel Kneale had to kind of sit there and think, okay, so TV, how does it work? I remember an interview with him where he said they asked him to adapt a stage play, and in the play there was a conversation about an egg, like an uncooked egg. 2 characters were talking about an egg, and they were rehearsing it. Nigel Kneale was looking through the camera and realised that the picture quality was so low that you couldn't see that it was an egg. So he had to insert a line of dialogue. Now listen here, this egg is a problem, or whatever. And so it's things like that. It's like how to be visual, but not too visual, because people have terrible TV sets and all that. And he was involved in a couple of years' worth of like adapting plays for TV and finding out what the problems were. Then in 1953, 75 years ago, they had a slot which opened up for a drama serial. They didn't know what to fill it with. They said to Nigel Kneale, "Do you have any ideas?" And he went, "No, but give me a minute." And he went away and came up with the Quatermass Experiment, which is the first kind of TV science fiction thriller serial. He never really thought of himself as a science fiction writer, but he was kind of picking things that seemed different and exciting for TV. Without going into too much detail about it, because I'm sure that will come up in conversation about what kind of stories he told, it was a massive hit. A couple of years later, the BBC encouraged him to write a follow-up serial, Quatermass 2, which is literally the first ever sequel with a number on the end of the title. And the reason was because, A, he couldn't think of a better title, but also he had this kind of rigour and logic to his writing. If it's called Quatermass 2, that's got to make sense in some way to the story. So there is a rocket in the story called Quatermass 2. In the first Quatermass story, there had been a rocket. So this was the second rocket, and it's Quatermass 2. And then a few years later, Quatermass and the Pit. And then basically he just continued writing for TV. And he developed this style, which is why I love him. He is a terrifying writer. He's a great writer of horror and science fiction, but he would never really want to think of himself as writing those. And he wasn't a fan of the genre. But the stuff, when he wants to be scary, really scary. He did write non-horror stuff, which I have to admit I've not really seen a lot of or know a lot of, because it's frightening things which really get my attention. And he continued to write those for an incredibly long period. So in the 50s, he was writing the Quatermass films. In the 60s, he was writing films for Hammer Studios and other things. In the 70s, he wrote a lot of stuff for ITV. He'd fallen out with the BBC by then, so he's writing dramas for ITV. A lot of those are terrifying. In 1989, and I remember this, I was 8, he wrote what is still, to me, possibly the most frightening ghost story ever on television, which is The Woman in Black, the original ITV.
Oh my God, that's him as well.
That original film is, yeah. So,
wow,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's a good story, because obviously he was getting on by that point. He would have been, so he was born in 22, this is 89. So he's getting near to 70 years old, apparently they commissioned him to write the script. This is a story that Mark Gatiss tells, and I believe it's pretty accurate. They commissioned him to write the script. He went, okay, great. Give me the book. I'll adapt it. He wrote the script in a week and then just sent it to his agent. And his agent went, wait a minute, you can't just write it in a week. They'll think you've rushed it and you haven't done a good job. Let's hold it for a bit. Don't send it to the producers. So they didn't send the script for another 3 weeks. Then Nigel Kneale's agent heard that the producers were kind of going, my God, he's still sending the script in. You know, he's getting a bit old now. He's probably lost it a bit. Maybe we should think about getting somebody else to write the script. And I'm like, no, he's written it. Have it. And it's a fantastic script. I mean, I know The Woman in Black really well. I've read the book. I've heard radio adaptations of it. I've seen the other film. And the kind of little tweaks that Nigel Kneale makes to the story are really powerful. It is quite faithful to the book. It is scarier than the book in really clever, subtle way. It's a fantastic piece of work. That's the last kind of scary thing he wrote. Yeah, no, that's bordering on 1990. It went out on Christmas Eve, 1989. So he's basically got 4 decades of churning out kind of horror stuff. And then throughout the 90s, he wrote less frightening television, but he continued to write. So he wrote episodes of Sharp with Sean Bean. He wrote for Kavanagh QC. You remember the
yes,
the legal drama with Tom Thor. And then he kind of retired. He didn't die until 2006, and towards the end of his life, he still wanted to write, but he suffered some kind of brain conditions that meant that he couldn't really concentrate enough to write. But he did write. Actually, the one thing he wrote in the 90s, which was kind of scary, is that he wrote a 5th Quatermass story, Radio 3, and I heard it on its initial broadcast. It's called the Quatermass Memoirs. And it's not really a new story. It's just kind of a little drama about Quatermass reminiscing about his previous adventures. And it's a really good primer because it basically sums up the storylines, the first 3 Quatermass stories, in about an hour and a half. But it gives a kind of really nice emotional perspective on them. I can say that even though we've not really talked about the stories particularly, I can say this because one of the great things about the Quatermass stories and the whole approach is that every single story, I believe, and you may disagree with me because I know you watched a lot of them in preparation for this, but I think they're all pretty much standalone. And even the Quatermass Memoirs, which is basically a summary of the stories that have already happened, it would work if you didn't know those stories because it's just kind of a quite low-key tender drama about an old man racked with guilt. And one of the opening lines is in the Quatermass Memoirs. He's trying to write his memoir and he struggles with even the first line. And he says, the Quatermass experiment, they called it, not to give me credit, but just pinning it on me, to blame, the whole blame for every shocking, every appalling thing that happened. And they were right, quite right. You know, as Kneale says, Professor Quatermass is a man with a conscience, and he's haunted by the fact that things he's done have caused, he didn't intend it necessarily, but, horrendous things have happened because of his personal quest. His kind of scientific goal of advancing humankind into space. And we're recording this, by the way, on the day. I don't know when you can put this out, Dan, but
okay.
We just have news that the new NASA mission to the moon has failed.
Great timing. Great timing.
Well, yes, and that is the big thing about Quatermass as well, is that they were stories about space exploration written just before there was real space exploration, and putting men into space before any such thing had happened. And Nigel Kneale's work, one of the great things about it was he was always kind of reaching into the near future, seeing around corners. One of his other famous dramas that I was involved with a stage production of, the year of the Sex Olympics, is basically Love Island. It's about a reality TV show on an island, and it's about kind of the use of sexualized entertainment to subdue the masses. And he was always very concerned about, even though he was one of the key people in TV, he was always kind of distrustful of it in its power over vast audiences, and that comes into later things like even Halloween 3. It's a TV signal that is deadly, that will kill your children. It's that's a very kind of Nigel Kneale metaphor, and even though that film was rewritten by other hands, it still has that core of an idea in it, that suspicion. So yeah, that's a kind of potted Nigel Kneale, and I'm quite thank you for letting me go on like that. But I was slightly impressed with myself. But I think that was a kind of coherent stream of consciousness. Maybe it wasn't coherent. What do you think, Dan? Is there anything you'd like me to make clearer?
No. I think you're right. I think you're right. I think I didn't know much about Nigel Kneale, and just listening to you then, and I'm sure all the other listeners as well, they might not know very much about it. So thank you for doing that, just giving a bit of context to the film, because we're no spoilers, but it is the final Quatermass story.
Yes, well, it is. It is, because even the story that I just described, the Quatermass memoir, it's set before the fourth one.
Right.
So that he only remembers the first three stories. So yeah, and this story is called the Quatermass Conclusion. It's a clever title because it does conclude the story, but it's also the conclusion he draws, the hypothesis, if you like, about what's going on. But yeah, so
absolutely, yeah, and you can definitely see, like we were talking about John Carpenter then, and Halloween 3. You can definitely see an influence on his work from this, like especially that first film, the Hammer film that I watched, the Quatermass Experiment. I saw a lot of the thing in there.
Yes, it's a great favourite of Carpenter's. There's a good interview with him on YouTube where he specifically talks about that film and the influence it had on him. So yeah, and the Quatermass Experiment, the film, which Nigel Kneale was not actually involved with. The BBC basically sold the rights to Hammer without asking Kneale. The script for the movie was written by other people, and Nigel Kneale basically hated it. He's an interesting kind of acerbic character. In one of the recent interviews commemorating Kneale's centenary, I think Mark Gatiss said that, he had a kind of impatience to him, which you might get if you basically knew you were a genius and you were surrounded by less talented people who often had the power to tell you what to do. It doesn't mean that he was nasty in life. He was a good father. He's a loving husband. He's married to Judith Kerr, who wrote Saga, who came to tea. He died years ago. They married shortly after the war, and were always together. So there are these kind of quite acerbic quotes that Nigel Kneale delivered about most of the productions of his work. To be honest, he comes across as a very hard-to-please guy who hates nearly everything. And he did say about the film, The Quatermass Experiment, he said that they got rid of nearly all of my dialogue. The acting was terrible. I was not happy about it. And then he goes on to say, and Quatermass 2, the film, he says, Quatermass 2, if anything, was even worse. I've managed to do something about that. And for a long time, Nigel Kneale had the rights to that movie and suppressed it deliberately. He wouldn't allow it to be released anywhere. He did somehow, maybe he just mellowed as he got older, he did allow it to resurface many years later. But the Quatermass Experiment, the Hammer film, is a really important movie as well, because it's what gave us Hammer. Hammer as a production company existed, but the Quatermass Experiment was basically the first British film that showed that a horror-type movie could make money, and it's the success of that that gave Hammer the confidence to look forward to doing gothic horror films, which led to the whole tradition of the Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee kind of gothic adaptations, and basically 20 years of block products of British horror all came about essentially because of the Quatermass movies. And Kneale was kind of involved a bit with Hammer and would continue to work with them. But other people, did their main horror output. But it all started with the Quatermass Experiment.
There you go. You can all trace it back to that. So it sounds like all these links to him and, other kind of his contemporaries, if you will, of those kind of science fiction stories or horror stories. He sounds like a very influential. You were talking about Quatermass 2 then. I was thinking again about They Live, because it's a very similar type, these people, invasion of the body snatchers type thing.
Yeah, it's alien infiltration, isn't it? And Quatermass 2 was kind of written at the same time as Invasion, as the original novel, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers was based on. So it's not like Kneale was ripping it off, but he also didn't preempt it. It's just two different writers working at the same time, kind of both hit on this idea. And this is a thought I've had over the years, Dan, which I'd like to ask you about.
Sure.
I think you've seen the four film versions of Quatermass now, and those are the four stories. I think that within those four films, those four narratives, you've got every kind of alien invasion possible, apart from the original one, which obviously Kneale didn't invent, which was the H.G. Wells kind of invasion by force, the military alien invasion, which we still get, remakes of to this day. But, you've got the invasion of the mind, you've got human beings turning into aliens, you've got human beings essentially possessed by aliens disguised as humans. You've got the extraordinary thing in Quatermass and the Pit, which is that the humans are the aliens, they just don't know it. We'll probably discuss that a bit more, but specifically it's full of fascinating concepts that have both been borrowed from a lot, but also are kind of unique. And then in Quatermass, the Quatermass Conclusion, or just Quatermass as it was known when it was on TV, you've got an unknowable alien force, like an alien hand reaching across the galaxy and messing with the human race, and we don't even see them, which I think it's not often done in science fiction. And I know why, because it's kind of not really necessarily very interesting if you can't see the aliens at all, if you don't know what they're about. But also it strikes me as one of the more realistic depictions of an alien, as in something we cannot possibly understand. It's kind of like Lovecraftian. We'll never get our heads around it. And certainly on a film with a relatively small budget, you're not going to be able to show it very effectively. So in Quatermass Conclusion, and I guess this will be a spoiler, but I don't mind spoiling it, because if anybody approaches a film like the Quatermass Conclusion thinking, I want to know what the cool aliens are like, well, sorry, you're not going to see them. That, though, is the power of it. I remember thinking that before I'd seen it when I was a teenager, reading reviews about it. There's something really eerie and disturbing about the fact that we don't know who these creatures are, what they want, if they're even alive, because they're reaching from light years across space and therefore maybe hundreds of millions of years back in time. Is it even a current thing? That's one of the many reasons that I think it's kind of fascinating. Do we want to move on to talking in detail about that particular movie yet?
Yes, sure. Yeah. I enjoyed watching all of these, and I remember I messaged you saying, I'm watching them all, and going to watch the conclusion and stuff. And I think Quatermass and the Pit is my favorite. I think it's the best actor, the best shot, best story, best ideas and themes and stuff.
I would agree, and I don't think that, I think lots of people would say that. I love the film Quatermass and the Pit so much, but I wouldn't need to come on here and secretly defend it.
No, I guess not.
It has massive amounts of fans. Just to give a bit more detail on the background. So in the 50s, you have 3 TV series of Quatermass, the first 2 of which were remade very quickly by Hammer. The third one, the film version, didn't happen for a decade for many kind of complicated reasons. It wasn't happening. Eventually comes out in 1967. It was a success. Apparently Hammer kind of went, we could make another one, but you've run out of Quatermass stories. Why don't you make up something new? And it didn't happen as a film, but Nigel Kneale, he got his mind ticking over ideas. He ended up submitting scripts to the BBC in the early 70s. They were going to make it, then they got cold feet, possibly because of the material, possibly because it was just getting too expensive. So the script was written, but it went unmade. In the late 70s, Kneale gets approached by Euston Films, who's the ITV drama production company responsible for making things like The Sweeney, one of my favourite TV dramas. Again, it returns us to the notion of the difference between British and American attitudes to TV. Euston Films, kind of like a company who went, I don't understand why the dramas made in this country are all kind of stagey and theatrical and timid. we should be making stuff back like The French Connection. And their whole thing was, let's take drama to the streets, let's use film cameras, let's make little action movies. And as someone who went to film school and ran around with a 16mm film camera and knows how difficult it is to do that kind of stuff with like finicky technology, I think what they did was really impressive. And weirdly, that was a period where the BBC was not kind of the best in the land at making drama. They couldn't really do that kind of filmic drama. Euston Films did, and it was great. And Euston Films bid for the Quatermass script. Apparently, Hammer also wanted to do it. They wanted to do it as a movie, but by this point, late 70s, Hammer was kind of falling apart. They probably didn't have much money, and Euston Films won the bid. But they came to Kneale with a really interesting proposition, which is another reason why I wanted to talk about this movie, because it's almost a unique thing. They said to him, look, we want to make it, but in order to make the most money out of it and to justify the production cost, it's got to be a TV series and a film at the same time. We'll broadcast the TV series in Britain, we'll put the film in other countries around the world to make the money back. And therefore you have to script two versions, one long version for TV and one short version for film. And he went, okay, sounds interesting, intellectual challenge, I'll do it. And it's not two completely different scripts. It is the same script for the film it's put down. And a lot of the scenes, most of the scenes are exactly the same, but short. But there are like a few scenes, 2 or 3, 4 scenes, where he's realised there's a bit in it where nearly a whole episode of the TV series has gone. They've got rid of it at the time. So he's obviously realised, right, we can't just cut from before that to after that. It'll jar. So he's written a couple of new scenes to go in the middle with just characters talking to kind of link things together, and it's all kind of like that. What happened then was that the TV series came out and it wasn't very well received in Britain, possibly because Quatermass is kind of a legendary name at this time in Britain. And, this was the long-awaited return, 20 years after the previous series, which had gripped the nation and changed TV. Another one comes along and people found it kind of depressing and slow and disappointing. And maybe because the TV series hadn't gone down that well in England, they didn't press ahead with the release of the movie in a lot of other territories. There was an Italian dub version of it I found on YouTube. It was on YouTube for a while. The title was Quatermass Conclusion, La Terra Explode.
They should have sold it with that title, and then it would have made all of the money.
I like to think that if it was only released in a few territories, maybe one of them was Italy, because I think it would have suited them down to the ground. Have you seen Zombie Flesh Eaters?
Yes. Lucio Fulci, yeah.
Yes, of course, yeah. We discussed Fulci before, and yeah. So that movie stars Ian McCulloch, the Scottish actor Ian McCulloch, specifically because a TV series he starred in Britain called Survivors in the mid-70s, which is depressing as hell and all kinds of brilliant. We talk about it on our podcast. It's not Nigel Kneale, but it's kind of in a similar vein. That show, which is really dour, and it's basically like it's COVID-19 times 1,000. Everybody dies of a cold, and the survivors just have to do their best. That's it. There's no big plot. There's nothing particularly exciting about it. It's really dour. That show was really popular in Italy. And as a result, Ian McCulloch was sought to be the star of Zombie Flesh Eaters. If there's one territory where Quatermass Conclusion might have gone down well, maybe it's that one. And also, I wanted to talk to you about it because it kind of connects to me with whereas the early Quatermass films were forward-looking and they, slightly futuristic in that they were about, they're about space travel before it happened and things like that. Quatermass Conclusion is actually set in the future. It's kind of post-apocalyptic almost. And in a way, therefore, it just links to Mad Max. It links to that whole swathe of Italian post-apocalypse movies of the late 70s, early 80s. It's part of that kind of movement. And I don't know if they realised that at the time. But I found myself trying to imagine what it would be like to be like an Italian cinema goer in 1980. who has no idea what Quatermass is, but just went into this movie thinking this could be interesting. I like The Ultimate Warrior and various kind of wasteland deathmatch type movies. How will this do? And then was kind of wondering how they would react to this kind of
very British,
very British, elegiac. I think I'm pronouncing that word correctly. I may not be. It's all about, basically, it's about the end of life. Most of the characters are elderly in it, and it's kind of shot through with a kind of pragmatism. It's not about victory. It's not about achieving the ideal situation. It's about just doing what you can. That's what I find fascinating about it, but I wonder how it kind of plays if you're used to a kind of more kind of schlocky, exciting kind of post-apocalyptic thing. And I wondered if you might be the person to ask about that.
I do. As you know, I do love a good post-apocalyptic film, and I do love my Italian exploitation films and horror films as well. But you know what? There is something I think to like about, even if it's not, they're not necessarily as action-packed or as gory or heavy necessarily on the effects. I think there is something to like about this character and this series of films. I like his political stance on things. I like that he doesn't, all these authority figures are always like, you're talking absolute rubbish, Quatermass. We wouldn't do that. And no one will die. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. You're off the project. I'll show you. And, he's kind of, there's this arrogance, but it's kind of earned as well, because he is this genius scientist who, again, wants to reach and propel us to the stars and advance humanity onwards. And he doesn't, and he talks about society and the politics and the bureaucracy getting in the way of true kind of enlightenment and the future itself. And I quite enjoy that. And I like that he kind of, good sci-fi is about something, isn't it? It's not just, here's a guy in a rubber suit. You know what I mean? It's usually, it has some unique or interesting ideas, which trying to say something about society, politics, the advancement of technology, whatever that may be. And I think, like we were saying, how influential this is, I think a lot of that can stem from these series of films or TV serials or books, whatever you want to call it, this franchise itself. Obviously, there'll have been stories before and definitely stories after, but I think there's something to enjoy. And I think his character is, in every version, he's very he doesn't really stand back. He's always like, right, let's go. He's not an action hero. It's not Stallone or Schwarzenegger or anything, but he still rolls into these situations, straight away, doesn't mess around. He is absolutely fighting to understand and figure this out, whatever the problem is, these alien issues, and I appreciate that, and I like that line you were saying about the blame and stuff, and I think that is him. It's kind of a responsibility he feels he has when he comes across these things or creates these things, these problems and these issues. He's this brilliant guy, and I like that in this one he's kind of, because it's almost like he's on the border between senility. He's becoming quite old and quite scared and vulnerable and not very confident. But then when he gets in that TV studio at the beginning, and then he's like, they're like, what do you think, Bernard Quatermass? And he's like, I think it's a horrible idea. I don't like the Russians. I don't like the Americans. They're awful. Superpowers, look at this country. And I will say, a lot of these stories are quite, prophetic, if you will. You were saying a little earlier that science fiction often does become science fact, and living in a post-COVID world and watching this film and going, and there's a voiceover from one of the Russian scientists, and he's like, in England most people have died from this virus, and there's political unrest and poverty, and I was like, this sounds all very familiar at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I've recently bought this wonderful book. I've not read all of it. It's called We Are the Martians, The Legacy of Nigel Kneale. It was published a couple of years ago. It's basically in-depth essays on a lot of his work. And there's an essay by David Peary, which is kind of an overview. And he's quite critical of the fourth Quatermass, because he says it's not a lot of Nigel Kneale's things, as we've said, are prophetic, but Quatermass forward doesn't seem to be. And that's one of the reasons why it was not well received at the time, And Peary says, yes, Kneale seems to think that London will crumble and fall to lawlessness, whereas the rest of the country becomes like an idyllic, bucolic haven or whatever. In fact, the opposite is true. Like London is this haven. Then I thought, well, hang on a minute. No, 10 years ago we had the riot, and now I think possibly we're looking at more, because of the energy shortages and things like that. And you've got the recent weather, which is worse in London, much worse. The other week when we had our heat wave, the few days of extreme heat, I was in a hardware shop and we heard the news was on the radio, and the newsreader described it as the heat wave emergency. And the guy behind the shop counter kind of laughed his head off and said, heat wave emergency? It's a sunny day. And what I didn't say was, yes, mate, but now people's houses are burning down.
Yeah.
And actually, like last year, I read the novelization of Quatermass, which is again by Nigel Kneale. It was just a fourth story. And I was reading that at the same time that we were getting the news about the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. You get a really strong sense from the book, even more so than the film, the distress and vulnerability of being in a dangerous world when you're an elderly person who's already kind of vulnerable, and you get hints of that in the film, like all the kind of, at the start of the movie, Quatermass just walks down London Street. It's very dark. In the book, it's clear that there are people living in those houses who either can't afford or are afraid to put their lights on.
Wow.
Like, just hide, Yeah, then I looked at the news and thought, not necessarily London, but as a world as a whole, we are not far away from this. And obviously there are places in the world where it's been like that for a long time. Kneale was a basically deeply pessimistic person, and he seemed to be aware that you can build things up, but even the strongest things crumble if you don't maintain them. And we're seeing that with democracy, and we're seeing, the kind of events of the last few years of kind of it, without going into the political side of it.
Yeah.
It's kind of been a lesson in, don't get complacent, because anything you thought was sorted and fixed, it can still go away, it can fall over, it can be undermined.
Obviously, watching these films in quite a close proximity myself, I do really notice the kind of his trajectory. Kind of, again, it's that early one is, we've got to experiment, we've got to push boundaries, we've got to, break conventions, we've got to experiment, we've got to explore with these things we don't know, we need to understand them or figure them out. And then this one is kind of like, this is something I wanted to ask you, because it's obviously the story, the plot of the film, the Quatermass conclusion, is these planet people, which are a group of youngsters. Well, it's basically for the most part, it's most of the country of youngsters, most of the UK and all over the world. In fact, we find out later that are going to these kind of ringstone areas, like the
megaliths.
Yeah, there's like Stonehenge, basically, just not Stonehenge. And they're going there, and they believe that they're going to be taken off this planet. That's why they're called the planet people. And there's this religion, and they're like walking down the road, they're swinging the little things, and they're just going lay.
Yeah.
And all this other stuff. And they're like, one of my favorite lines in the entire film, really made me laugh, is when some of the planet people are attacking, I think, Quatermass and the other scientist. And the woman just goes, "Stop trying to know things."
Yes, that really struck me when I watched it this week. It's one of my favorite lines as well. Yeah, but she delivers that with such passionate venom as well.
She does. I believe it. Like, I believe it. It did. Stop trying to know things.
It was. You just think maybe this writer has a very low opinion of like young people.
Well, this is what I wanted to say, because obviously throughout the plot we learned that this alien message or the communication is affecting the younger brains because I think Quatermass describes that his brain's drying up. I think that's how.
Yes, he says that.
Yeah, the wetter brains are more susceptible to the signal or what have you. And let's put it that way.
Well, he does. Yeah, he says that metaphorically, I think.
Yeah,
and I like that moment because it does show that there are disadvantages to growing old as well. You know,
sure.
It's not like a. But I think it's characterized as an old versus young polemic. I don't think that's really.
Yeah. Because obviously we have all the way through the film there is this subplot of Quatermass trying to find his granddaughter. His daughter's dead, but the daughter of his daughter is alive, and he's trying to find her. And he keeps, it's really like heartbreaking because he's just like, here, take this photo and just keep the number, and if you see her, just tell me. And it's really like, oh shit, like. I can see the evolution of the character from the previous films that he's got to this point where he's just like, you think because in the initial beginning of the film he's beaten up and he's all over the show, and until he sits down in that chair in the studio where you think, all right, this is the Quatermass I know from the other films. This is him. He absolutely doesn't give a shit, a fuck. He doesn't give anything. He'll just say what he thinks and what he believes. And I like that. I like seeing that more vulnerable side to him because I don't think you get that necessarily in some of the other films or some of the other performances.
You certainly don't in the early ones. And now that you said that, we should mention for people listening who have no familiarity with the series, it is a peculiarity of Quatermass that the actor playing Quatermass changes almost constantly. In all three of the 1950s series, he's played by a different actor. And which was for practical reasons because the initial actor that they cast who was going to continue, he died before Quatermass 2 was recorded, weeks before they had to get someone else in at pretty short notice.
Wow.
Brian Donlevy, who plays him in the first two movies, is really the only actor to have played him twice on screen. And in Quatermass and the Pit, you get Andrew Keir, who was kind of a known British movie actor, much younger than he appears. I was shocked when I recently discovered he was, I think, 39 when he made Quatermass.
Really?
Younger than I am now. Imperious face, stunning grey beard. He looked about 55, but he was not 40. For the late 70s series, apparently the producers wanted a star name because they believed that would be necessary to sell the movie overseas. And they went to Sir John Mills, great British movie star of the kind of 40s and 50s kind of war movies and things like that, coming to the end of his career then. But the story is about elderly Quatermass. They needed an elderly actor with gravitas. And I was thinking, if they'd not been able to get Mills, who else would they have gone for? I was thinking maybe James Mason, the only kind of comparable person with weight. And of course, he was doing a horror TV by that time. He's in the original Salem's Lot.
Yes.
For instance. And I think it would have been interesting with him. But anyway, they got John Mills and John Mills, who was an actor in his younger days who was known for kind of military heroes in a way, and everyman, strong everyman. He's in loads of war movies. He kind of plays it against type for himself as this kind of vulnerable, doddery guy. And I believe Kneale himself wasn't very happy with that casting because he thought Quatermass should still have a sense of that kind of command to him, even though he's much older now. But John Mills definitely plays up the vulnerability. But it's a really nice performance because like you say, I think you can see the moments when the old fire returns. Sorry, Dan, you were going to say something there.
No, I was just going to kind of carry on with the plot, but yeah, there's definitely that sort of thing. But also, do you think, obviously, like Nigel Kneale is writing this in the early 70s, so there's quite a lot of stuff going on. There's punk movements, hippie movements, there's cults, there's Manson, there's oil shortages, there's superpowers combining their power for space stations and what have you. There was all this sort of stuff coming in. Do you think there is somewhere. Obviously, we have the daughter, and there's a link to, and there's other young people that come into the plot. We have Manimal's in this as well.
Yes, Simon McCorkindale, great Simon McCorkindale, who I will always love, probably mostly because of this. But he the year before this was made, he was also one of the stars of Death on the Nile, which is one of my favorite
Yes,
movies.
of course.
And he also, of course, as I'm sure that you will treasure as much as I did, he also leaned out of the mouth of a big rubber shark with a hand grenade in his hand in Jaws 3D, and what actor doesn't want to do that?
Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't?
Yeah,
But yeah, I just, obviously there's those elements, but do you think it's like it's an ageist thing? Like, obviously the older generation, because they don't hear this signal or don't feel it and don't gravitate towards this. Basically, this beam of light comes down periodically and senses human beings there and either obliterates them or takes them away, whatever that may be. But it seems to be the latter. It seems to just obliterate them. But do you think there's a thing like maybe Nigel Kneale was getting more conservative and reactionary maybe in his age, and that's why we see a lot of these things where old people never understand the young, or the young are just, I can't even get close to what they're thinking about, something like that.
Kind of old man yells at cloud thing, get off my lawn thing.
Yeah.
I think there's undoubtedly an element of that to it. Although Kneale was not amazingly old when he wrote it, it seems like the work of a really old man. It's about elderly people, but he was probably about 50, maybe, I think, when he wrote the script. And I think there are elements. Yes, he definitely is concerned and bothered by youth culture, but he's also, I think there are hints that he thinks that previous generations have failed the younger generations. There is a line in this, it might be cut out of the Quatermass conclusion film. It's definitely in the longer TV version. I do get a bit mixed up sometimes. The scene where Kick Along, you mentioned Charles Manson. Kick Along is the kind of leader planet person who's an imperious thug, basically, played by Ralph Arliss, kind of brilliantly. Ralph Arliss is now an MP, I believe. That character was consciously based on Charles Manson by Kneale. He was certainly kind of thinking about the current directions of youth culture, and he was concerned. But also, there are hints in the movie, like Kick Long shouts in one scene, he's addressing his followers, and he says, "We're going to the planet, leaving them behind. They bust it so they can keep it." And there is this sense that, it is the older generations who mucked up the world. And also the fact that it is a plot element that gradually becomes clear in the film, that this alien influence has been exerting its effect on Earth for decades. So it's not like the kids, if they are to blame at all for what's going on, it's not their fault, that they have kind of been sort of perverted. And I find it very moving, even though it's kind of metaphorical. But like that scene where Quatermass takes a picture of his daughter and he says to someone, "Look at her, isn't it there in the eyes, strangeness?" And I couldn't read it. It was all there to see all the time. That makes sense in a plot-wise. It's like only just realising what's going on. But also it's like eternal generational drama of looking at your younger people and going, "Oh my God, I've not given them enough time. I didn't understand them, so I didn't talk to them enough," or whatever, I've not reached out to them. I was always expecting them to reach out to me, kind of thing. I mean, I haven't got children, but I think it's not an uncommon thing to not be too in touch with the younger elements of your family, whether it's your own children or, your nephews and nieces or whatever, and then realise, have that heartbreaking moment of, "Oh no, I didn't reach out to them and now it's too late." I mean, not in my own family, but I've got a friend who has a son who is named after me.
Wow.
Middle name is Dan, and I don't know him. I've spoken to him over the years. I've bought him presents. I've kept in touch. But I suddenly realised I've never sat down and had a proper chat with this guy. I don't know him, and he's 18 now. I find that element of this Quatermass story moving. One of the reasons that I want to defend this fourth one it's generally unfavourably compared to the previous three, maybe for good reasons. But I think it has an emotional component that the others don't. And it has a sense of loss in it that the others don't. I mean, Quatermass and the bit it builds up to an emotional climax, but that's kind of connected to what's happening in the plot. Whereas the Quatermass conclusion has a kind of generalised emotional resonance. Everybody in it's lost something. It's about loss, and it's kind of about rediscovering what's important. Again, in that book, We Are the Martians, there's a big essay about specifically the Quatermass conclusion. And the person writing that essay concludes that the basic message of it is that Quatermass has spent all his life devoted to science and discovery and moving things forward. And at the end of his life, he's discovered none of that stuff actually mattered. All that matters really is love. And that's why he's trying to find his granddaughter. His wife's dead, his daughter's dead. I mean, it doesn't actually get mentioned in any of the film, but it is clear, especially if you read the novel of Quatermass, which, again, is weird, because not only did Nigel Kneale have to write a film script and a TV script at the same time, he also wrote a novel of it at the same time. None of them were based on the other. He was kind of doing them all at once. And they're all really great in different ways. The novel is very powerful. And it does make it clear in that, which is never, I don't think it's explicitly confirmed, certainly not in the films. But, Quatermass's wife was dead before the first Quatermass story. He's always been a widower. He's always been kind of traumatized. And that's probably what pushed him to focus on his work so much. But now he's realizing that he needs to reach out to his family again, and he's only got this one family member left, and she's off somewhere with these hippies, and he doesn't know what to do. I love the moment, like you mentioned, it's full of the heartbreaking moments where he's trying to hand out pictures of her and saying her name's written on the back. And at one point, he's trying to give it to a bunch of planet people, and he sees one of them who's a little girl. Looks about 6, and he says, "Here, dear, take pictures." And because she's a little girl, she does actually take one off him, but it slaps out of her hand immediately by someone else who can say, "Yeah, ignore the crazy old man." Sorry, I went off on a bit of a reverie there. But...
Don't worry. We love a good tangent here on Spider-Dan and the Secret World. I've gone on many a tangent myself. You were saying that there's two versions, there's 2 scripts. There's the film script and the TV script. So I'd like to know, I've watched the film version, so the shorter version. I'd like to know, you were talking about some of the kind of stuff that were kind of missing, not necessarily missing, but rewritten around for the TV version. So I was wondering if there's anything I'm missing out by not seeing the TV version, or is there a superior version of this?
The TV version is better because the longer length of it, 4-hour-long episodes. So it's about 3.5 hours long. And that kind of space seems appropriate for this story of endings and slow realization. But the film does a really good job of kind of getting all the details in, as does the film of Quatermass and the Pit, actually. It's weird because the TV series of Quatermass and the Pit does exist, and I have seen it. It's on Blu-ray, and it's like twice as long as the film. And if you've seen the film, you think, "Oh my God, it's twice as long. There must be loads of stuff the film missed out," and then you watch it, and it doesn't. The film has nearly everything in it, just does it faster and really efficiently. And Quatermass' conclusion is the same, but there's because of the nature of the story, it's less appropriate for it to be really fast-moving. So it's just nice that things get to breathe a bit. There are a few extra. Well, there's a big chunk that's not in the movie, which is, remember the scene where Quatermass and Annie, the great character, district commissioner, Annie, I can't remember her surname now, played by Margaret Dizak. She drives him into London to try and get him in touch with the authorities, and they get ambushed by some gangs.
Yeah.
And she has to drive through the barricades. In the TV version, the gangs actually manage to open the door of the Jeep and pull Quatermass out, and then they start firing at her with machine guns, so she has to just drive away without him. Quatermass manages to escape, finds himself in a weird community of elderly people who live in like it looks like an old kind of car breaker's yard. They've kind of made homes inside the chassis of upside down cars, and they have this interesting subterranean existence. And in the movie, towards the end, when he says, "Well, we need old people to help us," and then all these elderly scientists turn up to do all the kind of grunt work. A lot of those characters are actually people he meets.
Ah.
In the TV show in the elderly community, and there's some really good character stuff in there, and also there's kind of a good link to his ultimate conclusion, which is that this alien force wants a bit of humanity. It's not even, it maybe wants a bit of scent or something that's gathering from people. And the reason he comes to that conclusion is that he meets an old man in this community who's described as Quatermass as a scientist. So he goes, "Oh, I must talk to this man." It turns out, yeah, he's a scientist technically. He worked in soap manufacturer for like 50 years. And he talks about how they used to manufacture musk from the musk deers that they used to just slaughter and make perfume out of. And Quatermass says, "They use how much animal do they use?" And he goes, "Oh, hardly anything to trace," and that kind of gets Quatermass his brain ticking,
Right.
There's also the bit towards the end. There's a bit more about, and this is the only thing I find kind of awkward in the film, is after spoilers, Joe Cap has been bereaved and lost his family, and he kind of wanders around in a haze. You do get a bit of that in the film. There's more of it in the TV series, and specifically the scene, where Cap's kind of in the wreck of the observatory and he's trying to operate the equipment, and then kick along and the planet people kind of break in and they smash everything up. That seems longer in the TV series, and it's a really chilling kind of scene where they actually have a long discussion. Kick along realizes that this man who's heartbroken is kind of pliable, and he says, "It's okay, you can join with us, but first you've got to unlearn everything you've learned." He says, "All them words in your head, I don't want none of that." So there's this great moment where like Kick along says, "What's this?" and holds his arm up. And Joe Cap says, "Arm," and he goes, "No, there. It's like they have only one word which can be everything, and they try and get Joe to say "Lair" instead of "arm," and he does go along with it for about 5 seconds. Then he just goes, "No!" He can't abandon rationalism.
I was going to say it's very much like the rational versus the religious in this as well, and he's very much like straight away he's like, I don't like those planet people, they're crazy and they're dangerous, and and at this obviously they start walking through their the satellite dishes where they're based and what they're studying and stuff, and he's just going to shoot them. He's just like, I was like, there's kids, don't shoot them, they're just kids.
His wife, played by Barbara Kellerman, is very much kind of the soul, but her performance is weird. I often find she's kind of like a stop motion animation. She does everything a little bit too slow and deliberate. There's a bit where they go to Ringstone Round and the cops are there trying to subdue the planet people. And the lead cop says, "Can you get out of the way? I've got a riot on my hands here." And she goes, "He's making it. Joe!" And I want to be the director. "Can you just do that again, but 20% faster?" It's just, she just does this thing. But she's supposed to be, maybe she has this kind of spiritual side. And it does complicate and make interesting the whole kind of religion versus rationality side of it. But they have a Jewish ritual with the menorah.
They've got the menorah there that they light. And that's quite interesting as well, because obviously he's a man of science.
Yeah.
Yeah. They still practice some of the religion, and may even still, in the smallest part of him, still believe there is a God.
And it's interesting though, at the end of the film, when Quatermass and Cab are kind of looking up to the sky, waiting for the reappearance of the alien being, Joe Cap finally says, "And now I know what evil is. That's evil." Like, he's discovered the kind of truth of evil in the universe. And this is a theme in Kneale's work. It's about what spiritual evil is and how you define it. Because so he was married to Judith, who was from a Jewish family whose family escaped the Holocaust. He was very aware of the real evil in the world that, can prey on spiritual beliefs or proceed from them, but not necessarily in a kind of Richard Dawkins religion is the root of all evil way. It's more like thinking it's something within us. Maybe it doesn't quite come from where we think it does, but it's important. So like in Quatermass and the Pit.
Yeah.
Got a lot of stuff about the spiritual evil in humanity, but it turns out to all be linked to kind of alien influence. And again, that happens in this film too. And without wanting to go into too much detail about the others, just let's be clear to the listeners. I mean, I know you said it's your favourite, and I said it's most people's favourite, and it is amazing. Quatermass and the Pit, if you haven't read it, seen it, don't know anything about it, go and watch it. It's stunning. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but it did have this element the earlier Quatermasses don't, which is the explicit linking between kind of demonic traditional beliefs, human beliefs, with extraterrestrial stuff, and also the past of humankind being linked to something beyond, again, that kind of Lovecraftian connection of a history with cosmic otherness. And yeah, the first two Quatermass films kind of have elements that feed on that. You've got the fact that in Quatermass 2, everyone who's possessed by the alien has a kind of mark of Satan on them, the golden little burn mark, which is kind of like a very prone kind of folk traditions and history, and things like that. And the fact that the whole climax of the Quatermass experiment takes place in Westminster Abbey. There are religious resonances going on in those, but in Quatermass and the Pit, it becomes more explicit. And I think, kind of by accident, sort of invents folk horror, the genre of folk horror, mostly, although it's going around the world now, it's a very British genre. It's kind of about things that are in the land, the history of the land and the people's interaction with the forces of nature. I think there are elements of that in Quatermass and the Pit, the way they're talking about how people digging up trees in the past had led to psychic disturbances. And, this is written in the 50s, the film made in the 60s, at kind of the same time as the first folk horror movies like Witchfinder General. So 10 years or so later, the Quatermass conclusion builds on that. And it's another story, kind of coincidental, maybe somewhat unbelievable, that Professor Quatermass discovers another alien influence that is connected to the past of humankind, but in a different way. Although Nigel Kneale later did a clever retcon in the Quatermass memoirs, where he kind of describes the kind of carnage that is seen at the end of Quatermass and the Pit, where there is a kind of very post-apocalyptic destruction of London. That's the beginning of kind of the route to degradation that leads to the dystopia of the Quatermass conclusion. And in a way, that makes complete sense visually. I mean, one of the nice things about Quatermass conclusion, I think, is that it starts off with Quatermass walking through the ruined streets of London, and Quatermass and the Pit ends with him standing on a ruined street in London. It feels very much like a continuation of that attitude and that world, So there is a link there, and so I find that link between kind of science fictional thinking and a spiritual viewpoint endlessly fascinating and powerful, and you can do so much with it. And Quatermass and the Pit does that, and then Quatermass conclusion also does that. By the way, I've been talking about folk horror, and I'm not sure, if you've got a particular stance on that kind of genre or much knowledge of that emerging genre.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a big fan of The Wicker Man, which is
absolutely
one of the best, and one of the
favorite.
I'm also a big fan of League of Gentlemen, who are highly influenced by a lot of the things that you talk about on your podcast, Hammer, Nigel Kneale, obviously, and those kind of, and the Wicker Man as well. I'm looking for a girl and all that.
Yes.
So there is a lot of those elements that I quite like, and the kind of eeriness and the off-kilter feel. So yeah, I wouldn't profess that I'm a big, I'm very knowledgeable on folk horror. I've seen a lot of them, but I've seen enough where I'm like, yeah, I get it. I can understand the concept and what they're trying to do. And it's usually some sort of pagan thing or satanic thing. Usually, but not always. Obviously, there's you can have a kind of a folk horror film that doesn't really have any of that. I think in some respects.
Well, I really think it's where a film or a story where you draw horror from the relationship between people and the land and their past and the way those things interact. And it doesn't have to be satanic or whatever, but it's how you do it. And I really think it's an emerging genre in the past sort of 10 years. Ironically, since Mark Gatiss dug up the term folk horror in his documentary, A History of Horror, that was made in 2010.
Oh, I've seen that. It's good.
He aligns The Wicker Man, Blood and Satan's Claw, and Witchfinder General, and calls them folk horror. And he talks to Piers Haggard in that documentary. Piers Haggard directed Blood on Satan's Claw and is the first man who coined the term folk horror. There's an interview with him from the early 70s where he said, I'm trying to make a folk horror film. It's like, what's that? We've never heard of that. Now it's because Gatiss used that term and resurrected those films. I mean, certainly that documentary made me go and see Blood on Satan's Claw, which I'd never seen. I've got it on DVD now. And since that kind of re-emerged in a slew of folk horror movies, I think it is dominant genre of kind of low budget horror.
There's a huge documentary on Shudder about it as well, folk horror. It's just
okay.
Yeah, I think it's like 3 hours long or something. I've not watched all of it yet, but I made a start. And it's very fascinating. They talk about the TV, they talk about history of it and where it came from, what it's about, what it influenced, TV and film. But yeah, highly recommend it. It was very interesting. Again, it's a bit long, but I think if you break it up a bit, it's still really, really good.
Kind of thing that would see me through a few breakfasts, spread it out over a week or so.
Absolutely.
Lovely. I think, although because folk horror is about tradition and is about the past, you can kind of co-opt lots of past productions into it, and I think we are discovering that lots of different countries have a tradition of folk horror without realizing it. Horror movies about the history and about the land, and it's now kind of retroactively been kind of identified that Nigel Kneale was one of the pioneers of folk horror, because he, even before a film of Quatermass and the Pit, he wrote a TV play, which is sadly now lost, called The Road. It's set in the 16th century. There is an audio version of it recently remade by BBC Radio, and it has Mark Gatiss in it, of course.
Of course. Super fan.
And it's basically a ghost story set in the 16th century, but the ghosts are from the future. And characters don't know that, but the audience do, because they live in the future and they will recognise the sounds that are being heard and things. That's awesome. So that's kind of identified as one of the very beginning kind of rolling balls towards British folk horror. And then you've got Blood and Satan's Claw, and Piers Haggard, who directed that and coined the term folk horror, is the director of the Quatermass conclusion. And it's his other kind of masterpiece, and all these things kind of pull together.
The way your brain works is a bit like mine, but yours is on kind of British talent filmmaking TV. For me, it's just Marvel Comics. It's just all the various universes, all these random and weird characters, and maybe some other film stuff, but obviously of a different variety. But I do like how you managed to connect all that together. That was amazing.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we love links, don't we? And it's great, because I think the reason why things like that are fascinating to us is because life is random. It doesn't make much sense. But when you are able to find an area where you can link things together and go, it's because of this, it's a rabbit hole that is very pleasurable and reassuring to go down.
Yes, I often do it, especially when I'm collating the hundreds and hundreds of clone bores I've put together over time. I'm like, oh yeah, they're connected in a little bit of way. Oh yeah, they're quite similar as well. Oh, I can put those together. Yeah, that might be
it's a great format, the clone bores, because I used to say, I'm a film student, so film's a big part of my life, and I used to say the only thing better than sitting down and watching a good film, sitting down and watching two good films. So if you can find like a really complementary double bill, films that aren't necessarily connected in any way, but they just work together beautifully. So like I've always wanted to sit down and watch in one sitting. You know the movie Insomnia with Al Pacino, which is obviously a remake of a Norwegian film, and the movie The Pledge with Jack Nicholson. So both kind of, they came out fairly close together, and they're both kind of weird, woozy dramas of policemen at the end of their careers, maybe kind of losing their grip, in very different settings. One of them's in Alaska and is all bright white sun, and the other one is, I think, the Midwest, and everything's kind of sandy. But they both have this sense of, again, a bit folk horror-ish, of kind of the environment kind of working on the human being and kind of messing with their head, and finding their vulnerability.
No, I like that. Well, that sounds like a good one, actually. I'll note that down. Maybe that'll be our next one, podcast we do.
Just give me a call, man.
I will. Let's talk about the ending as well. I think let's talk about that. Obviously, spoilers. I thought the conclusion, was actually quite heartbreaking and quite effective, I think.
Okay, I'm glad you said that.
I thought, because again, we don't know about the daughter, the granddaughter, if she's alive, if she's dead, where is she? It's assumed that she's with the planet people because she's young, and and she's wandered off or she's disappeared, so it potentially could be with them. And right at the end, as all the kind of climax coming together, all the elderly scientists have figured out they just need to kind of create a sense of life within these ring stones, and pheromones and blood and tissue and whatever else they're chucking in within those ring stones to make it seem there's a presence there. And then what they're going to do is they're going to set off a nuclear bomb. They don't know if it's going to damage it.
That's the wonderful thing. Actually, this is a scene that I noticed the lack of a clear victory. It's more kind of about what you can do. It's not the ideal thing. They're pretty sure that what they're going to do is not going to damage it. They're going to wait for the beam to come down, and then they're going to explode a bomb at it. And they don't think it'll damage it, but it might just kind of shock it a bit. And I think it's a scene in the TV version that's not in the film where Quatermass says it's a bit like if you're walking along and you accidentally tread on a mosquito or something and it bites you, you will not tread in that area again. And that's all that they're hoping to do, is just give it a slight annoyance. And Quatermass is very clear. Cap says, well, you really think this will destroy it? And Quatermass goes, no, it certainly won't. This thing is thousands of light years away. All we can do is just shock it, give it a bit of a stun. I hope that works.
Send it a message. I think they use that term as well. And with all the religious talk, I'm surprised nobody mentioned the rapture. I thought that might be.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Because I was like, the whole idea is that they're being carried up. These select people, this group of people are being carried off potentially to a new world, a new planet, as they believe. I did like that bit where one of the politicians is like, "I'm just quite young enough to understand." I was like, "You're not really. You're at least 40." I was like, "But you're not. I wouldn't call you young. I wouldn't call you young."
Actor who I always reminds me of our friend Sean Mason.
Yes.
I'm glad you see that too. Yeah. If we remake Quatermass' conclusion, that's Sean's role.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because
that's why I thought he was going to say it's God or it's the rapture, or I thought this was his opportunity to go, well, I'm a God-fearing man and I believe this, and this is a great opportunity, and this is this. I thought he was going to go into that, but yeah, it's never really mentioned. Obviously, we have, again, all the Jewish stuff, the wife and the daughter, obviously, the Dr. Cap are taken. Again, it also reminds me of going back to Halloween 3 again. Obviously, we've got, at the end of that, Dan O'Hurley, there's a blinding light and he gets turned into like a pillar of salt or like this white powder.
I wish it was as impressive as that sounds. But there we
go. What else do we have? Obviously, we've got the killing primarily of children.
Yeah.
You've got, obviously, not Stonehenge, but you've got the Ringstone Round. And you've also got like a little jingle, a little nursery rhyme.
Oh, that's true. Of the nursery. Again, maybe some of these things they're either coincidences or they are Halloween 3 showing that it is as much influenced by Kneale as created by Kneale.
Yeah.
Because I think the jingle stuff was added to the film late in the day.
Yeah.
And I think probably long after he left the film. Well, yeah, the nursery rhyme in Quatermass is terribly memorable.
Yeah.
Poppity, ringstone round. I've known that word for word for 20 odd years, and there is nice discussion in it again, which connects to the folk horror thing, the historical perspective of of the meaning of nursery rhymes and where they come from. I think it is said in the Quatermass conclusion film version, but there's a bit more space for it in the TV one, where he says, I think that these markers, like megaliths, like Stonehenge or Ringstone Round or whatever, he says they were markers where human beings erected stones to mark places that had become terrible to.
And that's quite similar to Quatermass in the Pit, isn't it? Because in that, the spaceship or whatever it is underneath, it causes some psychic reverberations of negative energy, or they see things, or there's poltergeists, or there's, they see the future or the past, all that sort of psychic phenomena. They're said to be bad places, and it's called Hobbs End in that film, which is a name for the devil. Spoilers for that film as well. The aliens have a devilish look, if you will.
Yeah.
So there are some similarities, but they were saying that there's some sort of device like buried which is attracting the beams. And
it reminds me of Steven Spielberg War of the Worlds, like they were buried, long ago, somehow, for some reason, we don't know why. You could almost say plot hole. When were those markers? Well, obviously those markers were sent thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Because it's long enough for people to build standing stones to mark them. Why only now is the beam coming and the effects on the young people being felt? But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mind that. Like you said, it's been affecting them for years. It's like with space travel. Obviously, it takes quite a long time for light to reach us and various other things. And, so I don't mind the initial signal, like you said, has affected the youth for years and years and years and what have you. I didn't mind that too much. But I like that they build the stones as a kind of a warning, like an ancient warning, like don't come near these areas. Almost, because they've gone something a bit weird about these. We're not quite sure, but something not quite right.
Yeah, and he's really good at that, thinking about things that we've got used to always being there, maybe seeing them in a different way and thinking there might be a different rationale behind them to what we thought.
I do like a good horror movie that takes the ordinary, makes it extraordinary and terrifying.
Yes, that's absolutely one of the nectar-like things in horror. If they get it right, it's purely beautiful. And, I think a lot of horror storytelling tries for that. You can tell, and a lot of it misses the mark. You can tell when it's trying too hard, but when it gets it right, that's kind of what you want, really, the uncanny, the extraordinary inside the ordinary. And I think, again, that Kneale was like a master of that.
There's a theory within it that it might just be a machine just randomly going off. Like there might not be any rhyme or reason behind it. It's just this big thing that we can't really understand. And that's I think that's why they try and rationalize it like that, because they can't picture these kind of beings. They can't even fathom. They're like completely unfathomable super beings or godlike beings, which again I like, because I think if there was some sort of god, it would be something that we can, like Lovecraftian, like we said, like completely beyond our understanding of any form of life. Obviously there's no rules or rhyme to it. It's just is. So I quite like the mystery to it and the uniqueness. But obviously we get to the end, and lo and behold, guess what? His granddaughter is walking, because all the planet people just all of us start piling towards the ringstone round, and they're like, no, don't go too close, and don't do this and don't do that. And then I think he gets knocked over, gets knocked out, and bloody Manimal gets killed, doesn't he? Manimal?
Yeah, he's killed shockingly. I think Kekalong shoots him dead without even really looking at him. He just fires a volley from his machine gun. And Quatermass doesn't get knocked over. He sees his daughter, his granddaughter. He sees her for the first time, and he's so overcome by the emotion of it that he has a coronary.
Yes, now I remember.
He just falls down.
I quite like. Was it Dr. Cap? Yeah, Dr. Cap. Yeah. He's trying to protect them now, the planet people.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to stop them. He's going, don't do it. You'll die. And it's only when the planet people come that the beam activates, because even the fake, the scientific means where they've tried to create it and stuff, it hasn't worked. But when these people pile in, that's when the beam is activated. And again, you're having this literal heart attack and this literally heartbreaking moment as well, where the daughter actually doesn't go with the rest of the crowd. She sees her grandfather, and she goes up to them and she helps him press the button on the bomb to send the message. And again, it works, and it's quite a loving kind of sacrifice. And I really, I thought it really it did earn that. It did earn that in that ending, which I'm really glad of. Again, I think that John Mills, who's no stranger to this podcast because he was on our Doctor Strange and Dr. Mordred podcast.
I didn't know he's in that. Right?
Yeah, he's in the Doctor Strange pilot. Yeah,
right.
He's basically the Ancient One, but they make him into kind of a Merlin figure. I think he's called Linmer. I think very clever, isn't it? We'll have to go back and listen to that one. But I thought he was, again, Oscar-winning actor doing his absolute best, and it works. And again, it was really nice to see. Like, I think obviously a lot of big movies, it tends to be a young dashing hero, doesn't it? Or youthful people, teenagers, or like Stranger Things or something like that. But I like that it was the elderly and the older scientists that were like. It's a bit, again, relating it back to kind of modern things. It was like when COVID happened and they recruited in retired doctors and nurses, and it was kind of like that. And I thought that's kind of quite an interesting idea, and quite, because obviously I think sometimes like elderly or older generations can be demonized a little bit, I think. So it was nice to kind of see, I did like some of the stuff where they're like, they're forgetting things, they're not sleeping, they're tired, or they can't quite keep going, their concentration's fading. I like when that general turns up and they're like, is it okay? Is that bomb going to work? What's the radius? How big is it? Like, they're all kind of double checking each other all the time. They're like, we need to be 100% sure with this, because we won't get another chance because we're really old.
Yes, I love that scene with General. It's so simple, but just thump it. Simplest arrangement we could lash up. They just have a big red button, you just hit it. But they're all kind of looking at each other a bit suspiciously. They don't quite trust each other.
No.
They're making this big sacrifice. I find that whole kind of ending quite moving. It's it basically is just Quatermass and Cap. They know that they can't possibly survive this. They're just waiting for things to happen, and then they'll set the bomb off. They just have a quiet couple of conversations while they're waiting for it. Look at the other versions. And by the way, make it clear, if anybody's listening to this who hasn't seen it but intrigued, the whole series is on BritBox, I think. It certainly was when I was a member about a year or so ago. So go check it out there. In the series, because you've had the whole kind of subplot with Quatermass meeting all the kind of elderly people who live underground, there's a character called Edna, played by Gretchen Franklin, who was later famous as Ethel in EastEnders. And you can see her in the film Quatermass conclusion. She's there at the end. She gives him a cup of tea. And that's it. In the TV series, and certainly in the book where you've got a bit more detail still, she makes him a little packed lunch.
Oh.
She's like, right, you're going to have to blow yourself up to save us all. Have a flask of tea and a packed lunch. There you go. Bye. And they all go off on like the army truck, all these old people just waving as they go off. I think it is kind of beautifully, weirdly downbeat and very moving. And something that I only noticed on this viewing, and this is a show and a film that I've watched loads of times over the years. I realised recently that it is kind of my religion, specifically the Quatermass conclusion, or Quatermass, the fourth one, because I first watched it when I was a teenager. It was on the Sci-Fi channel back in those analog satellite days, and I taped it and watched it. And unfortunately, I didn't know of the existence of the shorter Quatermass conclusion, or I think I knew about it, but I didn't have any way of getting it. And whenever I tried to get people to watch Quatermass, the series, they would balk at it because it is 4 hours long, And now the Quatermass conclusion is more available. It's on the DVD and Blu-ray. You can see the short.
There was a time where there were like certain DVDs were editing like miniseries into a film, like It and Salem's Lot and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'd never got that. I was like, just make it. Obviously, they were like, well, we'll sell it as a film, obviously, but I don't. If it's meant to be, if you're putting it on DVD and it's meant to be a miniseries, just do it as a miniseries. You don't have to.
Yeah, but it's how technology has changed as well. Because until the late 90s, even if DVD was around, which was just coming in, the main thing they would have been thinking about was we've got to put this on tape. And with tape, it's like you're charged by the inch. So you make the thing shorter, as short as possible. And in fact, the Quatermass series didn't come out on video or DVD for a long time, probably because, big, long, double play kind of videos were quite rare. But they did release the TV movie version, the shorter the movie version, just because you could put that out on one tape.
Yeah.
Like a movie. So it was weird. So in those days...
I think Roger Corman had a similar thing. He was like, the perfect length of a movie is 88 minutes because you only have to use one film can.
Right. Oh, brilliant.
Shaving some more costs there. Good old Corman.
He was a man who knew his stuff. Absolutely. There's so much you can say about Corman. And another one I really like is Larry Cohen. It's off topic, but if anybody wants to know that the right attitude to take into making low budget films, read about Roger Corman and read about Larry Cohen. They knew what they were doing. Absolutely.
Definitely.
So back in today, when I wanted to try and get people to watch Quatermass, I couldn't. Nowadays, the shorter version is more available. But on the other hand, because we now live in the age of kind of binging and streaming, people are used to watching stuff which is like 30 hours long.
Yeah, I know. Stranger Things at the moment, their season, like every episode is the length of a film, I think, something like that.
Yeah, so I've heard. I suppose Quatermass series did lead me to my theory, which is the optimum length of the story on a visual story is 6 hours, because Quatermass led me to watch Edge of Darkness, which is even better, which is a mid-80s BBC miniseries directed by Martin Campbell, who later went on to make a lot of Bond films.
We covered him in Wizard Month as well. We did Cast a Deadly Spell.
Oh, I don't know about that film of his. Okay.
Oh, you'd like it. It's noir meets Lovecraft.
Oh, I have heard, I have heard of it, but I haven't seen it. Yeah, is that like a TV movie?
Yeah, it was HBO.
It was, because he did big TV and then he gradually moved towards movies. And
you can borrow the DVD.
Oh, thank you, man. That's brilliant. I'd love to see it because Edge of Darkness is my number one favourite thing, really. Although, there's obviously huge value in just TV that's kind of endless. I love, at the moment, I'm like watching West Wing for the first time, and I'm watching an episode every day, and it's just a wonderful feeling that there's hundreds of episodes to come, and I can just, bask in that world. But I think in terms of telling a story, if you can do it in 90 minutes, great. But if like a movie. But if you want to do it with the depth of like a novel and you really get to feel for the characters and know them, like 6 hours is kind of perfect.
Yeah, I think you can have a danger as well because obviously the pacing of a TV show is different from the pacing of a film. So I think sometimes when you mush a mini-series together obviously with this, it's different because they made 2 distinct versions. They wrote 2 distinct versions and they shot it. So it's not as kind of haphazard. I know with the Halloween, I think we talked about the TV versions as well of 1 and 2, and they came back and did extra films as well, extra bits.
Yeah, and you had that thing in those days, which makes sense, where movies would often have extra bits inserted to make them longer for TV, so you could have more adverts. And if they didn't shoot stuff especially for it, they would just find scenes that the filmmakers had cut out because they were not necessary or not very good, and just put them back in. There's like a really long version of the first Superman film.
Is that the one where he runs the gauntlet?
With the machine guns and all that stuff. That later on, many years later, the director kind of said that was a great scene, and he released like a director's approved version with that in. But I think there's already been a TV version where the director is not even consulted. It's just like editors in the TV studio go, what can we get? Shove it all in. So going back to Quatermass, I'm really glad that you liked the ending and found it moving, because I know that some people find it sugary and sentimental. Having such a gloomy film,
arguably gloomy film, and kind of dour and depressing. You've got a red and a blue gang. You've got Bloods and Crips, and you've got like the death of the district operator or whatever her name was. Like that's really disturbing, because she just kind of leans into the camera and her eyes and the eyes just roll into the back of her head, and it's just like Jesus Christ.
You hear her dying breath, like.
And it's just, and then he shakes her, and she's like right up against the camera, almost so it's blurring. But you just it's almost like she's leaning on you, almost, which is really disturbing. And then obviously we have at Wembley, which I think I read that it was supposed to be Stonehenge, actually, where that particular beam comes down. I think
they certainly wanted Stonehenge in it, but I always assumed that they meant Stonehenge to be ring stone round, and they couldn't get Stonehenge, so they rewrote it. But I think Wembley, because they would have wanted a big gathering place.
Yeah.
And maybe that would make... I think the stuff in Wembley Stadium is spectacular, kind of post-apocalyptic stuff. And I'm kind of sad that is dated now, because obviously Wembley Stadium no longer exists.
Yeah, true.
But, just those scenes with like thousands of crazed hippies and surrounded by body armor wearing militarized police with machine guns. It's great kind of post-apocalypse stuff. Again, it's a bit Robocop. The city's going to hell, and kind of positive authority responding with maximum prejudice. I mean, it's quite a brief scene, and not a lot in a way, but just the power of that. And going back to the Annie thing, she dies, which is horrible enough, but then a few minutes later, the beam comes down onto the stadium.
Oh, God.
So when Quatermass goes back to her car just to look at the body, he finds that she's turned to dust. The beam has even taken away her corpse. It's like there's not even anything left.
I think you see her glasses, don't you, or something?
That's right. Yeah.
I thought that was good. I will say it does, like, when you look at Quatermass's suit, it does look like he's covered in something a bit disgusting. It's like he's just an elephant's come and done his business. It's touched himself in it. An elephant's touched himself in a very intimate way, and it's gone right all over him, all over Quatermass. And I was
yes, certainly true. Yeah.
I kind of like the little girl aspect with the burns and stuff, and I don't know if it's calcification or whatever you want to call it, but I quite like that. And then again, they kind of have this almost exorcist moment or poltergeist moment where she levitates, and then hilariously just explodes. Just this little girl just exploding. It's just bizarre, but I kind of enjoy it.
It's really savage and strange, and kind of one of those things where, it's horrifying on one level, but again, a bit like with the stuff in Halloween 3, you can kind of imagine Nigel laughing about it as he's writing. Yeah, I'm just going to blow this kid up. Because, and she's quite a sweet character, and she brings out the best in people around her, try and protect her. And also, something I always found really moving. This is a girl who's kind of survived a visitation of the beam, and they find her, and she's alive, but she's been blinded, and she's kind of covered in dust. And they determine to take her into London, where she can be seen by a doctor. And they're carrying her out of the house to put her in the van, and they've wrapped her in blankets. Joe Cap's daughters are there, watching her being carried out, and one of them walks towards her mum and says, "Mummy, she's got my blankets."
Yes.
There's quite a lot of little moments like that. One of the taglines that Kneale used in writing publicity for this series was that it was science fiction with a human face, and which makes a lot of sense if you think, this is the late 70s, this is post Star Wars, special effects are starting to rule everything, and he's like, yeah, we'll make a big budget TV series, science fiction series, but I'm going to concentrate on the kind of emotional aspects of it. And going back to the very ending, where you find it moving, something I'd never noticed before properly, even when I've seen this loads of times. Quatermass and Cap are alone waiting for the thing to come, and they're getting the bomb ready. They're just ready to press the button, and this kind of beautifully British to put up a lip. Yeah, we're just going to wait an hour, and then it'll come, and we'll blow ourselves up. Quatermass put a photograph of his daughter next to the detonator. Sorry, his granddaughter next to the detonator. Like, that's the most important thing for him. It's like, yeah, I didn't find you, but I tried, and I'm doing this for you. And the very kind of ending where he has the cardiac arrest and she helps him for the switch and helps him press it. Some people have read that it's either, you can either read it as bad writing because she doesn't know what he's doing there. She doesn't know that it's a bomb. Why would she help him press it? You could read that maybe it's kind of cynically undermines the moving of it because she is so lost in her kind of planet person reverie that she doesn't really know what she's doing, and therefore, she doesn't know she's blowing herself up. But on the other hand, right next to the button she helps him press, there is a picture of her, and she must see that. And I don't know whether she has a conscious thought, doing this for me, whatever it is, but it's a clear sign that he has been thinking about her all this time. And again, it's.
I mean, if you walked over and you saw a giant red button, what would you think it was for?
Well, to be fair,
and would you be tempted to touch it?
I probably would. I mean,
I think I'd be like, yeah, why not? Boop. Someone told me not. It's red. Someone's told me not to touch it, so I have to touch it now. She's obviously not going with the crowd, so I think she has maybe some wider understanding, or maybe her brain is expanded with all these signals coming in, and because they do seem like almost in a trance sometimes. So maybe she has a greater awareness. Maybe her brain is expanded, that she has this kind of psychic phenomena, like in the pit, where she can maybe read his mind or know what the intention is. She might know that he's dying and what the plan is. Who knows? But it still worked for me as an ending. And again, I think you can argue that some of the things in the film don't work perfectly. But I quite enjoyed it. I can see why you like it, and I can see why you like this character and Nigel Kneale's writing. And I definitely think it's worth seeing along with all the other films or TV series, whichever, or read the books or any of the books you've mentioned about Nigel Kneale. I think are definitely worth seeking out if you like this type of thing. If you like, heady sci-fi and interesting ideas, and being those kind of challenging political, social, economic things that the Nigel Kneale's trying to say. And again, I was thinking, is this like, all these youngsters, I don't like them, I don't understand them. I was thinking about that, but there's too many touchstones in the film for it to be that simple, I think. We've got the young kids from Dr. Cap, we've got him searching for his granddaughter. Like, end of the day, these elderly people are doing it and saving the world for the young.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, there is no future for them.
No,
Right.
absolutely not. So,
And
so that's who they're doing it for. Yes, they've noticed this, and maybe they feel somewhat to blame. Again, I mean, like even Disney now is dealing a lot of this story of generational trauma that carries on down the line. Is this idea is kind of, it's very much in those films like Encanto or Coco, in kids films. Like this is definitely not a kids film, but the idea is inherent to all of us, and parents, whatever you feel about your parents or your family and what have you, there is always going to be that disconnect. Like the older you get, the more conservative you get, the more kind of afraid of the world, and you don't necessarily understand it, and obviously you can develop mental conditions or phobias. So like look at Winston Churchill. He started off as a liberal, then he was Labour, and then he was Conservative, which is kind of sort of how politically, like, elderly people kind of go and side.
Kind of the story of everyone.
Exactly.
In a way. Yeah.
In a way. So yeah, there's a lot. I think there's a lot to like about this film. I would, I'd be interested to watch the TV series. Maybe not right now, but I might dip back into it at some point.
I would recommend leaving it a while, which is what I do. I never watch. The good thing about Quatermass as a whole is that every story, there's more than one version of it. You never have to watch the same one twice in a row. You can alternate the different versions, and therefore they always feel a bit surprising.
I think you're right as well when you were saying they all feel like a one-off. There's some continuity between them, but it's almost like a Bond film. Like there's not a strict continuity, but you kind of understand that happened in the last adventure and somewhat.
Yeah, and I think mostly in the first two, especially, because it's the same actor and the same, they're very aware of the first one. But this brings me to an interesting question that I was going to ask you. Do you think I think it's an interesting question anyway, you may not, but do you think if you had not seen the earlier Quatermass films, you would still have enjoyed the fourth one? Would you recommend it to someone who's not seen the others?
I'm not sure. Not really thought about it. That is a good question because I don't have an answer. So I think so. I think as a one-off, you can still enjoy it. I think, but I think I quite liked his kind of evolution almost, and the way he's approaches these different situations. And I think everyone has played him in a slightly different way, but it still feels right. In its own way. Of course, of the versions I've seen, the Hammer and this version as well. There is a continuity there, even in the performance and the writing and the stylistic choices as well. But yeah, I think it adds to it. It certainly adds to.
There's more resonance because it's that mythic thing of the person who was the hero coming back and not having a glorious return, but actually having kind of fallen from grace. I guess it's more powerful if you know about the past of the character.
I'd say it's a bit like something like Logan. So like the Hugh Jackman Wolverine Swan song.
Yes, which I love.
Yeah, and it's an amazing post-apocalyptic Western. There's lots to love about that film, and I think that is still a great film on its own. But knowing all the stuff that's come before, the best and worst X-Men films, but knowing that this character and being familiar with them and loving them and caring for them and watching them fail and succeed and all that, I think it just does add something that it might not have necessarily on its own. But yeah, I do think you can get something out of it if you don't know about the past, Nigel Kneale necessarily, those past films or serials. I think there is definitely something unique and interesting. When you were saying like Mad Max, I was like, yeah, they definitely saw Mad Max before they made this.
Right. Yeah.
I was like, wow, yep, very Mad Max. But then it's kind of unique as well. It's very rare that you get like a post-apocalyptic like English movie, like quintessentially English as well, because this is quintessentially English. It's not like trying to be an American film or anything. It's, it still has that English feel to it, which is totally unique for something that's post-apocalyptic, because we don't really tend to do that here, really. And I think now if we did it, it would just be all CGI and that sort of
Well,
stuff.
I suppose it's because the era of time when post-apocalyptic movies and literature really bit was when the British film industry was kind of falling apart. So
Yeah.
there are no Hammer films that do that. And following Hammer, there were no films being made in Britain really for a while, hardly. There are films made of kind of semi-apocalyptic British novels like James Herbert's The Rats and John Christopher's The Death of Grass. But The Rats is a Canadian film that Death of Grass became an American film. There's an international appeal to apocalyptic fiction and apocalyptic cinema, but British cinema didn't seem to be able to grasp it or make something productive of it. Which is why it's clearly
maybe it's that stiff upper lip of like, we can't imagine things going this poorly in Britain. We're fine.
Well,
society will never fail.
I do love the way in the film of V for Vendetta, you kind of go, all the other countries have fallen, only Britain soldiers on. But yeah, the fact that, in a way, I wish that this movie, Quatermass Conclusion, had wide theatrical release around the world that was intended, because it would have been the one that got through and gave a British statement on that kind of genre. But maybe the fact that it didn't shows why British cinema didn't do that, just never had the infrastructure or the confidence to put out that kind of material. But I do think it's a shame. But the film exists, so
it does.
I encourage people to watch it.
Yeah, it's very unique. It mixes a lot of those things, a lot of those genres, those ideas, and there is a lot to take in. And I enjoyed it. I don't think all of it works all of the time.
I'll give you an example. I'm sure there are others, but there's definitely a bit where you can see that it's a condensed version of a TV show. And mostly the film gets away with that very well, but at the end where basically there's just a really strange hard cut, and suddenly Joe Cap, who for the previous half an hour has just been some wandering guy on his own, suddenly wakes up and goes out with tent, and the army's all around, and Quatermass is there. And Cap's first thing is, where's Quatermass? As if he's a man who he's seen in recent times, you know.
He must be nearby. Yeah, I definitely noticed that, but I just chalked it up to him having a big bonk on his head.
Right.
I was just like, he just happens to be right, or maybe he's that young that again he can sense things because he's a youngster. He's a young man. He says. But no, I've really liked digging into Nigel Kneale, and it's nice to celebrate his centenary, even if it is a bit late. It's been nice to have you back on the podcast as well.
I'd like to say as well, his birthday was in April, so we've still got like 3/4 of the year left.
Oh, there we go.
Still his centenary, as far as I'm concerned. By the way, I need to thank you, Dan, because you pointed me on Facebook towards the fact that because it was his birthday week, they were selling cheap DVDs of Nigel Kneale dramas at network.com.
Yes.
So I went and bought some, which I've still not watched, but I'm very glad to have them.
Yeah, so I saw that and immediately I thought of you because again we talked about this and we talked about you've always talked about Nigel Kneale in some capacity and your love for him, and that's why of all the people to talk about Nigel Kneale, I had to have you on to talk about him, and I'm really glad I have, because again I didn't know anything about him. I've not read any of his books. Does he kind of measure up to a lot of his contemporaries like the Ray Bradburys and others?
Well, he's not a literary writer, really. He literally only wrote 2 books. He wrote that collection of short stories when he was very young, and he wrote the novelization of Quatermass.
Right.
That's it. Everything else he wrote was for TV or film. In a way, he was a strange example that he was a specialist. That was his medium that he worked with. But some critics like Kim Newman have argued that he is the only writer who works mainly in TV, deserves a stature comparable to like Ray Bradbury and not just people in the science fiction genre, people like J.G. Ballard and kind of great novelists like that. He was a brilliant writer of prose. The Quatermass novel is brilliant, and I've just started reading the Martha Kane stories, and they're wonderful. And he did say that he'd like to write more of that. I think he just got not sidetracked, but he's put on that path to TV and film, and that's what he learned and knew about. And that's why he was such a wonderful adapter of other people's work, So he wrote an adaptation of Wuthering Heights. He wrote an adaptation of 1984, like I say, The Woman in Black. He just had an amazing vision of how material could be changed to fit the screen kind of beautifully. And as I said earlier, he worked that out by doing it, by being kind of the first person almost who had to work that out. And he never lost that ability. Most of the other books that he's published are books of scripts. So in the 50s and early 60s, when you didn't get repeats on TV and you didn't, obviously there was no home media to release anything to, you quite often got scripts published for people to read. So all the first 3 Quatermass scripts were published. And in fact, the scripts book of the first story, The Quatermass Experiment, is still the best way to experience it because it was a live drama and they only recorded the first 2 episodes. So it doesn't exist. The film version is very different, which Nigel Kneale didn't write. So, the script is there. And then Quatermass 2 was recorded, and I've read the script as well. It's wonderful. And the bit was recorded. So basically, he wrote 2 novels and a load of script books, and that was kind of it. But there's a quote that I'll get from the introduction to We Are the Martians, is actually from his obituary when he died in 2006. A writer called Tim Lucas said about the novelization of Quatermass. He says, largely on the strength of this novel, and of course the Quatermass series of stories as a whole, I've always regarded him as one of Britain's greatest literary visionaries, on a par with J.G. Ballard. I can't say it better than that, really.
No, I you know what, Dan? I think that's a wonderful place to finish with a lovely obituary for the man. So, yes, I think that was hearing your defence for this and hearing your love for Nigel Kneale. Before we finish, I just want to ask you, where can all the lovely people find all of your work, find you online, and your very good podcast?
Bless you, sir. Well, my podcast, and now the podcast starts, is on most of the usual podcatchers, but our website is andnowpodcast.com. We started off as perhaps the first podcast ever to be solely devoted to the films of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, but we later mutated into perhaps the millionth podcast to be devoted to basically anything and everything within the genre of horror, and therefore we have a really random and wide range of topics to cover. We have a bunch of very, I think, apart from myself, very wonderful hosts, including occasionally Spider Dan himself joins us. And,
too kind,
sir. I'm quite proud of it. It's not exactly regular. It's not exactly every week, but there's lots of episodes, and we will soon be doing more. I'm also occasionally can be heard on other podcasts, such as Very British Horror, which is what it says, wonderful discussions about particularly British horror subject. And also, I'm on the We Made This network, for whom I write reviews for their website, wmtnetwork.com or wemadethisnetwork.com, not sure. Occasionally turn up on their podcasts, such as the Doctor Who-based podcast called The TARDIS Crew. So, yeah, I can be found in most of those places. And I've got a couple of writing credits coming up that I wish I could tell you about.
Ooh, exciting.
But the only reason I can't is because they're not 100% definite yet, so I don't want to jinx myself.
That's fine. I can't wait to hear about it and read them as well. I'm very much looking forward to that. But yes, I'll leave all the links in the show notes so people can find you in those various places. I've also linked our previous episodes to my website, so there you can find that in the collaboration section if you want to find it there. Quick way to find them all: just click on the links, and it'll take you directly to the podcast. So yes,
and just one final thing to say about podcasts: we will have a Quatermass episode coming up. It's been delayed a bit because our friend Howard really wants to be involved with it, and he hasn't been able to. Well, he hasn't been available recently. And it's got an interview on it with the British horror novelist Simon Clarke, who's a wonderful writer, and he's a particular Nigel Kneale fan. And he is the guy who said to me, I know you love the TV stuff and whatever, but you've got to read the stories and the scripts. And then so he came on our podcast, particularly to talk about the literary stuff. So hopefully that will occur later in the year. I don't know exactly when, but within the centenary, I hope.
Yeah, of course. Well, when that does get released, I'll share it, and we can have you can reference this if you want on that show, and link it back and whatever. But yeah, go check out. And now the podcast starts. I can't even speak anymore. We've been speaking so much, my teeth are falling out. I'm getting old. I'm getting the elderly. Oh, these youngsters! Oh, they're going off to another planet.
Not as bad as me, honestly. Gee, you should see the amount of vocal warm-ups and jaw exercise you have to do every day to be able to speak coherently.
Wow. Okay.
Any degree of time. So I'm 41, so maybe this will come to you, or maybe I am weirdly infirm when I talk to my GP about it.
Yeah, I do have some jaw issues, but it's mostly that it never stays shut. I think that's my problem. But
well, that is certainly not the worst problem.
No, well, there's a reason these podcasts go on long, and there's a reason it's called Prattle World. There was method in my madness before I even started, so there you go.
A man who knows himself.
I do.
To be respected.
I know my flaws, certainly. So you can find me on Facebook at Secret Bores, Twitter at Dan_Bores, Instagram SpiderDan at SpiderDan Secret Bores. Review, like, share, subscribe, comment, etc. And don't forget to use the hashtag #PrepareForPrattle. See what I mean? When you interact with us. If you want to join the Prattalion and to be briefed in full on the Secret Bores, swing over to Prattle World at spiderdanandsecretbores.com. That's BORES. I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon. I am Jack's Musing, Simon Cotton, Paul Meller, Max Byrne, Scott Hodgson, Mike Burton, Angry Andy Reviews, Tonya Todd, and Tony Farina for their continuing donations. It is very much appreciated and helps Prattle World keep on turning. And if you ever find yourself in a position to help the podcast, please consider it. Thanks again, Dan. This has been eye-opening, and I hope it is as eye-opening to everybody else who listens. But I've really enjoyed talking some Nigel Kneale. And I kneel before his altar.
Oh, that's wonderful, sir. I think that's a marvellous note. It's been a pleasure, Dan. It's been an absolute thrill. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Bye.